I wanted to go ahead and add this video to do some further explanation on Project One, the digital self-portrait. So let's go ahead and get started. If you're in my in-person class, you may or may not need this tutorial. It could be a good refresher if you're kind of confused or forgetting some of the steps that we learned. But if you were in person, we did go over all of this. So I'm going to start with Photoshop open. I already have a couple of documents open here, but just for the sake of the tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and go to File, New. Or if you've just opened Photoshop, you would see that screen that we looked at before that will look something like this. And we're going to create a new file. And for this project, we're creating a letter-sized file that is print ready. It's a little bit different than exercise 1, which was a digital banner ad. So once again, in the preset details on the right, we're going to keep practicing those good naming conventions. This will be part of your grade going forward, so please make sure that you're always naming your files correctly. And that's always going to be outlined in the modules on Canvas for each exercise and project. So once again, just as a refresher, we're naming it Art 137 underscore your last name underscore project 1. And for this file, we want to make sure that it's 8.5 by 11 inches, so 8.5 inches wide, and make sure that you have inches selected in the units drop-down menu on the right side here where my cursor is. And then we want to make sure that it's 8.5 inches wide by 11 inches height. And the orientation should look something like this because we're creating a portrait. If you want to, you can select the landscape orientation if you're using a horizontal or landscape format image. But I think most of you, especially if you're just taking a quick selfie or somebody took a portrait of you on your phone, most of you are probably going to use the portrait orientation, but either one is acceptable for this project. And then just make sure that your resolution is 300. Make sure that pixels per inch is selected. So once again, we want 300 ppi or pixels per inch. And then the color mode, you want to make sure that you select CMYK color and leave this at 8-bit. I think some people were messing with this and getting some problems in their file. Make sure that it's CMYK 8-bit color selected. You shouldn't have to select that. And then make sure that under background contents, you have transparent selected. And then I just wouldn't touch any of these other things in the advanced options. You can actually just sort of close that if you wish. So we have a letter size document, 8.5 inches wide by 11 inches height. We're going to go ahead and hit create. And it should look something like this, like that document that I already had open on my screen. And you should initially just have this layer 1. This is your first layer in this document. This project is going to be pretty time consuming and it's going to feel a little bit repetitive, but the idea is that you're practicing these new tools that you're learning, and repetition is a good thing in Photoshop because it's only going to help us learn, especially if you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable with some of the selection tools, or even feeling a little bit uncomfortable with using a mouse or trackpad or tablet if you're using one of those. This is just going to help you build that confidence and build those skills. So the more comfortable you get with this, the quicker you're eventually going to become in Photoshop. So we have this blank document right now. It has this little grid background that basically represents the transparent background of this file. And I'm going to go ahead and drag in an image to use here. So going to Finder if you're on a Mac, or File Explorer on PC. Because I have pretty good file organization here, it's pretty easy for me to find the files that I need. So I'm saving these particular files in a Project One folder, which I highly recommend. I have a demo folder. Yours might look a little bit different. And then I have this image of myself here that I'm going to be using for this portrait. So from Finder, I'm just going to go ahead, click and drag this into Photoshop. You can also, I'm just going to delete this, or sorry, I just did an edit undo. To show you another way of doing this, if you're a little bit uncomfortable with clicking and dragging, once you've created that initial file in Photoshop, you can go to File and then Place Embedded, which is right here. And from there, you'll have a similar window to Finder where you can look for your image that you wish to use. So once again, this can just be an image from your phone, from a digital camera, some sort of digital image, likely going to be a JPEG image. You can use AirDrop to get this image onto your computer. If you're familiar with that on iPhone, you can also just email an image to yourself from your iPhone or Android device, whatever is easiest to get that image onto your computer. And if you did that File, Place Embedded, you select the JPEG and then just hit Place. And it's essentially doing the same thing. It's just a different way of importing that image. And an important thing to note here, once you've placed the image in your document, you want to make sure that your image fills the entire document. So you can see if I zoom in a little bit, I've got some of that transparent document showing up behind my image. I don't want that. The idea is that we're going to be painting every single pixel in this image. So you're either going to want to make your image fill this entire crop or this entire screen or document, or you're going to be painting those pixels yourself. So if I had a smaller image that was like this, if that's really what I want for my composition, I'm going to expect you to be painting in the sky and tree and whatever other elements of the background here on your own. So to make life easier, I would suggest just increasing the size of the image and making sure that it fills up my entire document. I'm actually going to go over a little bit just to make sure. And then I'm going to hit enter to place that image. And you can rename the layer here in the layers panel if you wish. It's just called original right now. I think I'll leave it as that. I think that's pretty clear. And then what I'm going to do is make my first layer. And then I'm actually going to go back to this original layer and I'm going to lock it. And this is just a helpful tool because we're going to be painting on top. You can see when I have the move tool selected and I click and drag this image around, it's going to move. So I want to lock it in place because I just need it there as a reference and I'm going to be painting on top of it. So with that layer selected in the layers panel, and you can tell that a layer is selected when it has this light gray shading on it. You can see right now I have layer 1 selected. Now I'm clicking on original. So original is selected. And then I'm just going to hover over this little lock icon. When I do that, it says lock all. So I'm just going to lock this layer. So lock all means it's going to lock whatever layer or layers you have selected. So it's locking that. So now you can see when I try to click and move it, it's not moving. Now I'm going to select layer 1 and I'm going to zoom in and start making some selections. Maybe I'll start with the sunglasses here. You can really start with any area of the image that you wish. But I'm going to do this like fairly quickly. For you, it might take a little bit more time, and I do want you to be pretty detailed in the way that you're doing this. And I'll show you a student example later on. I'm going to start with the polygonal lasso tool. You can see that I'm hovering over it in my toolbar right now. I think this is going to be a great tool for most of you, but we are going to go over a couple of other selection tools that you can use. But this one's a great one to keep practicing. You should have practiced it a little bit in exercise 1. So I'm going to start with selecting these little kind of darker areas of the kind of tortoise sunglasses here. So I'm just going to click, 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 and make a little lasso or selection around this spot here. And now that I've clicked in that initial spot and completed the selection, you can see I have those marching ants, that dashed line. So I've made a little selection here. And I'm going to select a color that I'm going to fill this layer with. And I'm just going to hit I on my keyboard, or you can also go to this eyedropper icon in your toolbar, but get used to clicking I on the keyboard. It's going to make your life a lot easier for this process. And I'm just going to click And you can see that it's selected this dark brown, almost black color of the glasses right there. And then I'm going to hit G on my keyboard. You can see my cursor has now changed to this little paint bucket. You can also select the paint bucket icon that I'm hovering over in the toolbar. If it's not showing, just click and hold. It might be showing the gradient tool, so just make sure that you click and hold and select paint bucket tool. And now I'm going to zoom in so you can see this better. I'm just going to click inside this selection here. Just click, and now it's a solid color. And then I'm going to go up to select and deselect. I'm going to go back to that move tool just to move this around so you can see that I've created this layer. I'm going to go to edit, undo to move it back into that place. And once again, edit, undo is going to be a really helpful tool for everything you do in this class. You can always go to edit, undo, or Command Z or Control Z if you're on a PC on your keyboard. So I'm actually going to rename this layer right now, and I'm going to call this, all I did was double click on the layer within the layers panel. I'm going to call this sunglasses pattern. And it's a good idea to keep making new layers with each selection, but it might even be better to do that a little bit less frequently. It just kind of depends on how customizable you want this file to be. So in this case, I'm going to start making selections for all of these darker colored kind of stripes in the sunglasses, and I'm going to put that all on this sunglasses pattern layer. So I think that's just sort of a nice way to work. Make sure you're naming your layers appropriately so that you know sort of what area of the portrait they're referring to. And then you'll see how we can sort of reorder and move layers around in a moment here. So I'm going to use the polygonal lasso tool again. And just sort of roughly, just for time's sake, I'm just going to click some general areas. And then in the options panel at the top, I'm going to make sure that I have this add to selection button selected. And that way I can keep making selections before I fill them with the same color. So this allows me to work just a little bit faster. So I'm just going to keep making some quick selections. Yours might take a little bit more time, and that's a good thing because mine's just for demo purposes. So I'm just going to keep selecting these kind of dark brown stripes in the sunglasses. And I might not do all of these. I'll just select a few just to show you. Okay, I'm going to stop there. And now I'm going to hit I on the keyboard again to select that eyedropper tool. And I'm going to select another dark brown. It's going to look pretty much the same as that first one. And then I'm going to hit G or hit this icon in my toolbar, the paint bucket tool. And just if I just click on one, it's going to fill all of those areas that I've already made the selection of. And now I can hit select deselect, or a quicker way to do this is just to do Command D on my keyboard, Command D or Control D. And now I've deselected. And I've created this solid color painting over the sunglasses. And now what I want to do is select this area underneath the stripes of the sunglasses, and I'm actually going to make that a new layer. So in my layers panel on the bottom right, I'm going to hit this little icon in the very bottom right of the screen next to the trash can. If you hover over it, it's a little plus sign in a rectangle, and it says create a new layer when you hover over it. I'm just going to click that, and I'm going to double click on this layer and call it something like sunglasses base because it's sort of underneath the pattern. And once again, selecting the polygonal lasso tool, I'm just going to make a sort of rough selection around the sunglasses frame. And I'm just going to do this side of it just because I'm focusing on this area of the image. But I probably should do the whole frame, but just for the sake of time, I'm just going to select this part of the sunglasses. And then once again, hitting I on my keyboard, I'm going to select this sort of lighter brown color. And then I'm going to hit G on the keyboard and fill that area with the lighter brown. And then I'm hitting Command Z on the keyboard to deselect that area. So now I've created this sort of general lighter brown shape that's representing part of the frame of the sunglasses. But you can see there's an issue here where now I'm losing the pattern, and I just need to reorder my layers in order to make sure that this is all appearing correctly. So if I look in the layers panel on the bottom right, sunglasses base, I'm actually going to rename it sunglasses frame. That might be a little bit easier for me to remember. And I'm just going to click and drag this underneath the pattern. And now you can see this is the way I want things displayed. I want that lighter brown underneath the dark brown stripes. So I've now painted over just this very small portion of my image. I do want you guys to get a little bit more detailed with this. I'm just kind of breezing through this to keep our video fairly short. I'm going to show you a couple of other selection tools that you can also use in addition to the polygonal lasso. If you go right beneath the polygonal lasso in your toolbar, you can test out this quick selection tool. It might be showing object selection that you used in the exercise, so just make sure to click and hold on that icon and make sure that quick selection tool is selected. And this is also W on your keyboard if you want the shortcut. I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer, and I'm going to rename it eyebrow. Maybe I'll say left eyebrow. It's left on my screen, but it would be my right eyebrow in real life. And now making sure that I have that quick selection tool selected, I'm just going to click and drag around this eyebrow. Oops, it might not be the best example here. Oh, I think, sorry about that. I think I actually need to have the image selected. So when you're using this tool, this might be a trickier one to use for this project, but I want to show you anyways, but let's see if that works. There we go. To use this tool, because it's grabbing pixels, and it's sort of similar to that object selection tool where it's using Photoshop's processing capabilities to select and recognize pixels for you. So in order to use this, you want to make sure you're clicking on the original image that you have because it's grabbing from those pixels. But if I have, this empty layer that I just created selected, it doesn't have any pixels to select, if that makes sense. So I want to make sure that I have the image selected, and then I can always go back to this layer to add the painting portion. But with my image layer selected, I'm just going to click and drag around this eyebrow shape. And then if you look up at the top to the options panel, say it's selecting a little bit more pixels than you want, you can make sure that you have this little paintbrush icon with the minus sign selected. If you hover over that, it says subtract from selection. So it should default to new selection or add to selection. And then you can start to edit the selection you've created by hitting subtract from selection. And then you can just sort of click and drag, and it's going to deselect some of those pixels for you. So now I have this sort of rough selection of my eyebrow here. I'm going to make sure that I select that new layer that I just created that says left eyebrow. Once again, hit that I on my keyboard, select a color here to use that I'm going to fill this selection with. I've selected a brown color, and now I'm going to hit G on the keyboard and fill that with brown. And then deselect, and now I've created this little sort of jagged eyebrow shape. And Photoshop did most of the work for me where it's approximating pixels based on color, and it was creating that selection for me. So if you want to be pretty precise but have kind of a cool geometric feel to your portrait, the polygonal lasso tool will be your best bet. But if you want to mess around and play with the quick selection tool, you can definitely do that also. And then say I want to edit this eyebrow shape further, but I want to work in a non-destructive way so that I have access to this whole shape that I've created later on. I can always create a layer mask on it. So with that left eyebrow layer selected in the layers panel, I can hit the little layer mask icon below. You can see now I've created a mask, and I can use the brush tool if I just hit B on my keyboard, and then make sure that with these color swatches at the bottom of the toolbar that black is on top because I want to be removing pixels in the mask. I can just brush over this. Say I want the eyebrow to be shorter, I want to add a different color there. I can quickly just brush and do that, but you can see if I turn my mask on and off, I still have all of those pixels to work with if I need them later. So that's another way that you can edit things. So some of you might not have a lot of masks in this portrait, some of you will. It just sort of depends on how editable you want to keep your painting. Okay, so let's do one more tool for selections. We can go to that quick selection tool. Again, you can click and hold and select Magic Wand tool. Once again, we need the image pixels to use this tool, so I'm going to click on that original layer. And let's just see what happens when I click on my nose. So all I did was just click once with the Magic Wand tool, and it's selecting this sort of lighter highlighted area of my nose in the image here. And then what I want to do is create a new layer. So in the layers panel, go back to that create a new layer icon, click that, and I'm going to rename this layer left nose. Once again, I'll hit I on my keyboard, eyedropper, sort of a skin tone color from this image here, and then hit G on the keyboard and fill it. And then I just did a Command D to deselect. And I'm going to select that image layer again, go back and hit W on my keyboard to select the Magic Wand tool and just click an area here. And you can kind of just keep clicking around and see what Photoshop selects for you. I just want to select this smaller part of my nose here. Now I'm going to create a new layer, call it right nose. I on the keyboard to select another skin tone color, and then G, click and fill it, and then Command D to deselect. So you can see what I did there. This gets a much more sort of jagged selection. I think it's a good one to play around with, but a lot of you, once again, might want to go back to the polygonal lasso tool, or you might want to create layer masks on these areas and kind of finesse the shapes a little bit. So you can see I just created a layer mask, and now I'm sort of going back in and refining the edges here. So that's one way of working. Another quick selection tool that you might find helpful if you want to just make like a broader selection. Say I want to just kind of fill this blue area in the top right corner. I can select M on the keyboard, or the second tool in the toolbar, rectangular marquee tool. I could just click and select a rectangular area. This is a great way of just making really broad selections, and then you can always refine them or add more layers on top. So then I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to call this blue sky upper right. Hit I on the keyboard, select a blue color, then hit G and click to fill it, then Command D, and now I've created this blue shape that's representing this portion of the sky. I'd prefer if you don't use this selection tool a lot, and it's going to be tricky to do that with the face, but if you want to make some broader selections and fill them with flat color for the background, that's another good way to do it. So just like a cooking show, I'm going to go ahead and open up a file that I've worked on a little bit more, and then I'm going to show you a student example that's even more complete. Let me just make sure that I'm opening up the original file. So we can see that here. So you can see I've made some broad selections with the rectangular marquee on the right in this file. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn my image layer off in the layers panel so that you can see what's been painted and what hasn't. And just to make sure I go over this, in the layers panel on the right, you can see next to each layer or next to each group, which I'm going to go over in a second, there's a little eye icon to the left of them. If you click that, you can just quickly turn the visibility of the layer off. So you're not deleting anything, you're hiding it. So you can see I'm just clicking it on and off. So when I click it off, now I can see the amount of the artboard here that I've filled in with paint. So you can see I still have a lot of work to do, but this would be acceptable for a first draft. If you were just turning this in for first draft, you can keep your image below it when you export the JPEG, or you can turn it off. It's up to you. I think it's probably more helpful to keep the image on, especially if you haven't completed a ton of it yet. But this is totally acceptable for a first draft, especially because we're still learning here. And, you know, especially because this is a time-consuming process. But I'm going to expect you to basically have this entire artboard filled in with painted color using those selection tools, using the eyedropper and paint bucket to fill. I don't want to see any transparent pixels like I'm seeing in this document here. This should all be filled in for your final turn-in. So once again, for draft, the first draft, this is totally fine. But for the final turn-in, I want to see everything filled in your document. And another thing I want to show you, so we talked about layer visibility. I want to see good what we call layer hygiene. So layer hygiene, similar to what we've talked about with file organization on your computer. We want to keep things as organized as possible. Just because this is great practice for working in real life, especially when things become really collaborative, you're sharing files with other people. We want to make sure that things are organized in the best way possible. So you can see that my file here is somewhat organized, and that's done by grouping things or grouping layers. So you can see I've created a sky group. If I turn that visibility on and off, it's just this sky portion of the portrait here. If I turn the sunglasses on and off, I've got layers that are only referring to the sunglasses that I've painted there. Same goes for the eyebrows, the forehead, the hairline. So as you work on your file, I want you to keep that in mind and start grouping things sort of based on section of the face, based on the object that you're painting. You know, just group things in the most clear way for you. And if they're the most clear way for you, they should be pretty clear to me as well when I'm grading these. You don't necessarily have to rename each individual layer. I'd like to see some naming of layers just for good practice. But for the most part, I want to see a lot of grouping and naming of the groups. So I'm just going to ungroup this sky area just to show you how to group layers. So you can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers here that are all different as I select them and move them around, all different colors, different selections that I've made. But I want to group all of these and name it sky like I had done before. So in order to do that, I'm going to select the layer that's on top, which is this layer 33. Just to go over this again, I'm just going to double click and rename it. We'll call it blue upper right. So to rename layers, you just double click on the name, start typing in whatever you want to name it, and hit enter. So blue upper right is the one that's on top, that uppermost layer. I'm going to select that. You can see it's selected because it's in this light gray shading. And then I'm going to go, I'm just hovering over layer 30, which is that bottommost layer that I want to group with it. I'm holding shift on my keyboard, and then I just click that. And when you hold shift on the keyboard and select, it's going to automatically select all of the layers between the top and the bottom. And with all of those selected as they're seen here, I'm just going to click this little folder icon in the very bottom of the layers panel. And when you hover over that, it says create a new group. Just going to click that, and now it's grouped them all together. And now you can turn the visibility on and off. I'm going to double click and rename this group. once again to sky, hit enter. And now I've got a nice group of layers that I can move around if I need to, or turn on and off, or just keep organized so that I know exactly what they are. And another thing, you might not need to be moving layers around a ton for this project, but if you do want to shift things a little bit or just sort of practice, you can go to the toolbar, make sure that you have Move Tool selected. And in the Options panel, most of you, it's probably going to default to Auto Select. You probably want to leave that on, so make sure that little checkbox is showing. And you can play around with auto selecting by layer or by group. So if I change it to by group, and then I click and try to move these layers around, it's going to move the entire group at once. So that's another reason why grouping layers can be really helpful. So if I need to move the glasses over, I can do that. I can move all of that at once. I'm just going to go ahead and change that back to layer, and now you can see it's auto selecting by individual layer. All right. So that's it on the layer grouping and good layer hygiene. So I'd like to see something that looks like this. I'd love to see a lot of groups and a lot of layers within those groups. And I'm just going to open up a previous project from a student I had before. You can see he has 2 overall groups in his portrait. If I click the little arrow to the left and open it, I can see there's groups within those groups. So that's another thing you can do, is you can make individual groups and then you can create like overall groups for them. You don't have to do this, but I do think it's nice organization here. So you can see he's named this one Skin Under Glasses. If I turn that on and off, I can see that it's labeled correctly. It's referring to exactly what's in the portrait. He has eyes on a separate group. I can turn that on and off and see exactly where those eye layers are. Mouth, teeth. This is really good layer organization, layer hygiene. And you can see if I zoom in on this, there's quite a lot of detail in this, and this is the amount of detail that I would love all of you to aspire to in your projects. And you can see he used some selection tools, but he also did a little bit of brush hand painting to create the hair. That's always an option as well, but I'd like most of you to just sort of keep practicing those selection tools. He even did some hand painting with these little dots in different shades of gray to show that sort of highlight on the zipper of his jacket. That's a really great detail. Okay, so back to my project, and you can also look at the examples that I've posted on the Canvas page. Those are great student examples as well. So let's go to this more finished version of the project, or sort of my finished draft at least. I'm going to turn the image layer back on. And I'm just going to make sure and do a file save to make sure that my PSD file is saved. And I'm actually going to do a file save as to make sure that this is in the place that I want it, because this is from the spring semester. So I just did a file save as, and I'm just making sure that I'm saving my original, should say .psd file here. I'm saving it for project 1. And just hit save. And now what I'm going to do is export a smaller JPEG version of this file that I will upload to Canvas. So previously we had done file save a copy, but this time we're going to do file export and save for web. And this is going to create an even smaller version of this file. And this is, try to memorize this as best you can or take some notes. This is what we're going to be exporting as for the majority of our assignments. So once again, I have my PSD file open. Always make sure that you're editing your PSD file and you're only exporting JPEGs to turn in. So with the PSD file open, I'm going to go to File, Export, and then Save for Web. Click that. And then you get this modal window here that says Save for Web at the top. If you go over to where my cursor is in the lower left, you can zoom out if you need to see the entire image. And then with the settings on the right, just make sure that you have JPEG selected. It might default to GIF or something else. Just make sure it says JPEG. And then you can sort of play around with the quality of the image here. So you can see if you look back over to the bottom left, it says JPEG right here where my cursor is. And then it says 581.5K, that's kilobytes. That's going to be a nice size for this, but you can sort of play around with the options on the right. So you can see it says medium currently, and that's just sort of the overall quality of the image, the amount of compression that Photoshop is going to put on this image to save it at a smaller size. So medium, you can try high, just sort of depends. See what happens when you select high, and look at the lower left and see how large it is. I'd like you to try to keep these images at about a megabyte or less. So if you're at 775 kilobytes here like I am, that's a great size to import into Canvas. This is going to be inserted in your reply on the discussion board. So we want it to be a fairly small JPEG so that it previews quickly and easily in Canvas. So I've selected high, probably medium or high is going to be good for most of you. I wouldn't play around with any of these other options. It's probably going to default to have optimized selected, progressive deselected. So just keep that as is, just sort of match what I'm doing here. And then the only other thing we're going to mess with is image size here. So something that we're going to be doing going forward in our assignments is we're going to be resizing our JPEGs so that they are 1920 pixels on their longest side. So for most of you, the longest side of your image is probably going to be the height. You can see this is 3,300 pixels height currently, and it's about 2,500 width. So most of you are probably going to have this size, but if you did do the landscape, you're going to be changing the width. But I'm going to go ahead and change the height, which is the longest side of the image, and I'm going to type in 1920. And it should default to what we call constrained proportions of the image. So when you type in 1920, it's going to make the width 1484. So it's going to automatically resize the width as well. But if it's not doing that, make sure that you have this little toggle on that says constrain proportions. It should just default, so probably just don't click anything. But your image size should be this, where it's 1484 wide by 1920 height. So those are all the changes that we want to make to export this JPEG. So now we're just going to hit save where my cursor is in the lower right. And I'm just going to save this in my project 1 folder here. And it should automatically just use those same naming conventions. You can see I've highlighted here as the PSD file. So it's going to be art137 underscore your last name underscore project 1. I'll just remove this V1. That's just for my purposes. So this is what your JPEG should look like. And then you'll just hit save. And then just as a quick overview in Canvas, I got some questions on this, so I want to make sure everyone understands. To turn this in Canvas for that first draft, or really for the final, you can use the same process. Just make sure you go to modules. Make sure you're turning this in on the correct page. So for the first draft turn in, this is under Project 1, Digital Self-Portrait. I'm going to go to this first draft turn in and critique page. And there's a discussion board here. Some people have already started turning this in. You're just going to select reply, and then it will open up this text box for you. You can add your description here. Just please make sure to always read the instructions and follow them carefully. So you're going to give a brief written description about your image. I'm not going to do that here, but that's up to you. And then you're going to go to Insert Image and then Upload Image. Click that. You'll see this screen here. You can either drag the image here from Finder, or you can just click this icon here. And if you're organizing your files well, it should be pretty easy for you to find your JPEG image. So we're inserting the JPEG into the text box here. And you should see a preview of it here. And once again, if I go back to Finder and just double check the size of this by clicking on the image, it's 382 kilobytes, which is a great size. You want to keep this around a couple megabytes or smaller. So if it's in the kilobytes, that's perfect. That's what you want. You don't want to be uploading the PSD file here, for example, because that's going to be a lot larger. So back into Canvas, we've uploaded the JPEG. We're going to hit submit in the lower right. And now you can see the image is previewed here in the text box. So we always want to do that insert image, upload image for the JPEG version. And then for the PSD file, we're always going to attach it here. You can see where my cursor is over this button that says attach. We're going to hit attach, and then it will prompt you to choose a file. Hit choose file, and then you'll select your PSD file, hit open. And once it's selected, you should see something like this. You can click to remove it if you clicked the wrong file, but it should look something like this. And then you will hit post reply. So you're always going to insert the JPEG image into the text box, and then you'll always be attaching your PSD file as an attachment. So it'll look something like this. So everybody will be able to see a preview of the image with everyone's personal description of their project. And then only I should be able to see the PSD files that I can then download. Okay, so that's our tutorial for project 1. Hopefully that clears a few things up and makes this a little bit easier for you to continue in your process for this project. But of course, you can always email me with any further questions.